Hey guys, what is up? Swim here, and today we're going to be breaking down the power rankings for constructed of the 6 regions as they currently are in the game. Now, some of the things are going to be tweaked before, the full release and Legends of Runeterra is playable again, but I think this kind of stuff is pretty fun to do, even if some minor changes will occur. So, right off the bat, let's go ahead and go into our number 6, which is going to be Noxus. Now, let's go ahead and break down. I'm doing this in the wrong order. A more professional person would have detailed the actual structure of this a bit more first. But basically, these are just for constructed, not expedition. And mostly, low rankings are going to mean it doesn't find places in a lot of different high tier archetypes, right? Or deck lists. So Noxus is pretty weak. I would say the weakest out of the 6 right now. Pretty close to number 5 though. There's a couple of good cards you have in Noxus for each different archetype. Legion Rearguard and Brothers Bond are going to be pretty great cards in any aggro deck, right? And it's got even some like fairly solid control cards. Probably most notably Whirling Death. But the archetypes that it's in often finds ways of maybe like thinking about cutting Noxus, which is definitely a bad sign. There's a lot of like Ionia stun recall decks that are actually thinking about getting out of Noxus and running like a second color instead, which is a pretty bad sign for the color. You can say the same thing about spiders. I think the most optimal spider version probably uses Shadow Isles and P and Z for Von Yip instead of going into a couple of the Noxus spiders that really don't end up doing much. I mean, House Spider is pretty solid and Arachnoid Host is alright, but spiders definitely doesn't really Nox doesn't really offer a ton to the spider archetype either. And the same is even true for the self-wound archetypes. There's versions of Freljord's self-wound that are just running Tarkaz instead of Vladimir. And when you're able to run Tarkaz instead of Vladimir, you can find yourself a whole other new color, right? So there's a lot of different ways to build these decks that, ultimately don't really feel like they need Noxus, right? Noxus doesn't really have a whole ton going for it, and when a lot of its archetypes, definitely feel like they're thinking about giving it up, it definitely creates problems for the color. Next up, number 5, we've got Piltover and Zon itself. So Piltover and Zon, or PNZ, is obviously the kind of like more so gimmicky color or region. It does a lot of different things, but unfortunately, it's a little too muddled to be like what I would consider to be a very high tier region. Unlike Noxus though, PNZ feels pretty necessary in the archetypes it supports, right? For example, if you have a, spell-based archetype, something like Assembly Bot is pretty important, right? Assembly Bot is going to be doing very well in a spell-based archetype, which you would, mix with Demacia with, right? If you have something with discard, you're going to need Jinx. Now, you can run discard without Noxus, as mentioned before, but Jinx is really, really high power unit and pretty necessary for that. And there's even some fairly high tier control decks that are able to fit in Ezreal as a win condition as well, right? And Teemo is kind of like, he builds his own list. Now, I think Teemo lists are fairly competitive. They're a little bit, optimized ones, like aggressive versions probably, are a little bit better than a lot of people immediately might give them credit for. But at the very least, these lists just don't necessarily have to be great. What I would say is, PNZ feels more necessary for the lists that it uses as a color, but at the end of the day, the reason it's so low on this list is still because most of the lists it finds are not probably high tier lists. The Ezreal list in question might actually end up being one of the stronger ones, and I've been tinkering around with a lot of Von Yip decks as well. Okay, so next up we've got number 4, Freljord. Freljord is actually a little bit low on this list. It's pretty close to number 3, but it loses out a couple of points just because it lacks a lot of versatility. It's got a lot of power cards in Omenhawk, Averroes and Sentry, maybe some of the early aggressive challengers, Avalanche, and of course you've got some pretty solid top-end options, most notably in Tryndamere. If you're in something like a control deck, you're definitely going to want 1 or 2 Tryndameres, but it's not really a reliably versatile faction. There's not a ton of different things you can do with it. It's mostly got kind of this handful of power cards and not too much else. You know, the Frostbite deck is pretty okay. It can lead itself to some, you know, solid kind of control potential options in some of its cards, but it's kind of like a bit of a one trick, right? It doesn't really have a lot of flexibility in these like slightly weaker cards that you're not really going to use. Of course, Anivia kind of fits into its own deck, and that deck is somewhat broken. There's counters to it, but it is kind of powerful, and when it does snowball, it is able to basically get a free win. Okay. So, number 3, we've got Ionia. Ionia is a pretty powerful aggressive region. There's a lot of early aggressive cards in Ionia. They fit very well into a Hecarim Chariot deck, which is basically a tier 1 deck. People dispute about like how to build that deck, but right now Hecarim Chariot is, most people agree, like a very good deck, probably tier 1. And there's a lot Ionia can do on top of that. Kinko Wayfinder is used in Teemo decks. Zed is arguably the strongest champion in the entire game. You can put this in aggressive. And of course, they do have the very, very powerful Deny card, which, you know, I think we all go through a point in time where we think Deny is super OP, and then we consider maybe it's not that good. There's a lot of like Magic the Gathering logic that's like, well, counterspell's not that good. But in Runeterra, Deny just does so much more than a counterspell would in Magic. It's not really comparable in that way, just because of how the mana system works. You don't have to basically reserve the mana for Deny and risk losing it forever, which is a really, really big deal. Okay, but basically Ionia mostly is good at the kind of aggressive game plan, but even in its few limited tools outside of that is able to cover a lot of ground. Number 2 is Demacia. Demacia is a super powerful region. Basically, they kind of dominate the mid-range. Everything about Demacia kind of like screams mid-range, with even some pretty strong aggro tendencies, right? Like, they just own the board. Their units are very efficient. They've got, you know, elites, which is, I would say, one of the more powerful archetypes in the game. And they've got some pretty great options in terms of champions as well, with Garen being a solid, like, mid-range elite champion, Lux leading to her own archetype, albeit a little bit on the weaker end, and Fiora and Lucian being two very high-power early-game drops, Lucian being more aggressive, and Fiora, even if you're not playing for her ability, is just a pretty great 3/3/3 challenger body. So there's a lot that Demacia can offer. It's got, you know, early game aggression. It's got some pretty good combat tricks with Chain Vest and even Radiant Strike as well, if you're the kind of deck that wants to play for that kind of thing. But they just own the board so strong in the early game, more so than pretty much anyone else. And they've got a lot of amazing cards for capitalizing on that, with, you know, ways to basically buff their entire board over and over again. If you're in elites, you've got Vanguard Bannerman, right? There's even cards like On Guard that I think are surprisingly decent, given like the kind of mid-range tendency of the list, right? If you just kind of like open into a challenger attack, it's gonna probably wipe out a lot of like other mid-range lists and some kind of mirror for mid-range decks. So Demacia ends up being pretty flexible, surprisingly so, and basically very dominant at that kind of like mid-range speed game plan. And to nobody's surprise, number 1 is Shadow Isles. This region is just not fair right now, to be perfectly honest. It's just good at everything. On my stream, I've talked about how Shadow Isles is basically just that kid in the sandbox who's playing with the other kids but not sharing his toys, because Shadow Isles just has all the cool toys. They have pretty much the best removal, with Black Spear, the box, and even Grasp of the Undying offering 3 different ways to do 3 damage removal. Pretty rare 3 damage in this game. They're amazing at control. They're kind of like the control region, boasting such power tools as the Rekindler, who hilariously is a 5/5 for some reason. Rasa, an amazing late game drop. You know, Vengeance is solid. You know, I think a little overrated, but it's fine. Commander Lejos, Ruination, and Harrowing are even all very playable. And, you know, given the control game plan, it just has so many nutty cards. There's multiple different like hyper combo archetypes. They're the best at cloning with Splinter Soul, Chronicler of Ruin kind of like forms this kind of, you know, triangle with Cursed Keeper and Ravenous Butcher. They belong to, again, a tier 1 archetype, which is Hecarim Shark Chariot is super, super powerful. You know, they've got spiders, which are probably on the weaker end of things, I would say, but it's possible we just haven't seen, like, the refined spiders lists. And even, like, really innocuous tools like Vile Feast and Hapless Aristocrat, these things that effectively trade for 2 for 1 just so often, are very efficient ways at dealing with certain aggro decks. Basically, this region can just do it all. It plays at every speed. It plays at aggro speeds, mid-range speeds, control speeds. There's just almost nothing this region can't do. It's really, really, I haven't even mentioned Oblivious. I could go on, but I'm not going to. I could literally like talk about almost every card here. The region's really good. It's basically the reason I'm making this list. But that's it. This was just a pretty short video. I didn't want to do anything crazy. It's not going to be super in-depth. This was just kind of power ranking how I see the 6 regions. I'm curious if you might do them a little differently. I could see an argument for Freljord to be ahead of Ionia, or, you know, depending on how, or, you know, we evaluate the kind of meta. Noxus could maybe be ahead of Piltover and Zon. You know, I could see that. But for the most part, these seem fairly clear-cut in terms of, like, how powerful they end up being. I think these kinds of videos are interesting because it'll be interesting. Obviously, there will be some changes, but even with some amount of changes, it will be a very interesting experience to be able to, you know, when we can play the game in a couple months, look back at this and think about how wrong we all were about some things. You know, maybe some things I said here. Who knows? But that's part of the fun. All right, guys, that's going to be it for me, and I'll see you guys next time.